Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the Spencer Family, Community Health System, Harris Ranch Resort, Producers Dairy, Valley Children's Healthcare, and The Wonderful Company. Additional support provided by from the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's public universities. This is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Blake Zante.
Welcome to the Maddy Report. I'm Blake Zante, Executive Director of the Maddy Institute. In California, the Local Control Funding Formula, or LCFF, determines how all local educational agencies, or LEAs, in the state are funded, how they are measured for results, and the services and supports they receive to allow all students to succeed to their greatest potential. Now, well into its second decade, education officials and policy analysts have been able to step back and assess the impacts of LCFF. The Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC, recently published a report titled Updating California's School Funding Formula, Assessing Alternatives and Trade-Offs. Here to discuss this report is one of the authors, Iwunze Ugo. Iwunze Ugo is a research fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California, whose work focuses on education from preschool through grade 12 and further on into post-secondary institutions. Welcome, Iwunze. Thanks for joining us on the Maddy Report today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Well, great. We'll dive right in to the questions. We have a lot of ground to cover. Can you just talk, what are the core goals of California's local control funding formula, and what persistent challenges in student outcomes and school finances motivate discussions about updating it now?
So the LCFF was implemented in 2013 with the primary goals of, one, simplifying the state's school funding formula, targeting additional resources to high-need students, and also giving districts much more local control to spend those additional resources in the way that they see fit to best serve their students. The previous system was born out of Supreme Court cases in the late 1980s with the goal of equalizing per student funding across districts. And although it was successful on that score, in the decades between the 1980s and the late 2000s when this reform was implemented, it had become quite unwieldy. There was various holdovers from the 80s, as well as the a growing web of targeted programs called categoricals that resulted in a system that was quite opaque, even for the most kind of in tune policymakers, let alone parents and families. So the LCFF did a lot to simplify that system into a combination of general purpose base grants, as well as targeted funding for high-need students, again, with this district autonomy to spend those targeted funds as they see fit. As far as what persistent challenges have existed since then, the targeted funding in the LCFF has shown to be somewhat effective for improving outcomes for high-need students. We've seen increased test scores and other things for the students that receive targeted funding, although there still are achievement gaps. And coming out of the pandemic, we saw some of those achievement gaps widen a bit. So the challenges, although they've been addressed a bit, still remain. And then in addition to that, even at the time the LCFF was passed, there were some questions about the structure of the funding system. And, in the decade plus since, those questions have lingered. And, those drive a lot of the analysis that we do in the report. As far as what motivates motivates this discussion about updates now, it was a big lift to get the LCFF passed back in 2013, and immediately after, there was a lot of reluctance from the governor at the time, Jerry Brown, and the governor now, Governor Newsom, to go back to the drawing board on the LCFF. There was a lot of an ethos around letting the LCFF work first before making adjustments. But in more recent years, we've seen a bit of an opening towards efforts or interest in looking at the LCFF again. Two things I'd point to are the recent boost to the concentration grant that provides additional funds for districts with the highest shares of high-need students. We saw that go up from a 50% boost to a 65% boost, and then also the introduction of what's called the school equity multiplier, which provides even more additional funding for particularly high-need school sites. So we've seen this interest in making tweaks to the LCFF. So we thought of that as a bit of an invitation to step back and do this broader analysis of what the potential implications could be of various changes that have been mentioned in various outlets about potentially updating the local control funding formula.
Thank you. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back after this. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Iwunze Ugo from the PPIC. Iwunze, thanks again for joining us on the Maddy Report today. What are the fiscal and equity implications of switching from attendance-based funding to enrollment-based funding, according to the PPIC report, and which districts and students would benefit the most?
So California is one of the dozen or so states across the country that still fund their school systems based on attendance rather than enrollment. And what that means is that, the system is per student funding, but the actual students in that per student are the number of students that are showing up in school on average at a given day, as opposed to the number of students enrolled in a particular school district. And when we consider the difference between the current funding levels and what we would see if we switch to enrollment-based funding, that difference really comes down to differences across districts in attendance rates, right? The ones that have relatively high attendance rates would see sort of less funding or sort of less relative funding compared to those who have relatively low attendance rates. There'd be a shift to additional funding for them. And some might consider the way attendance is funded now as a bit of a penalty for poor attendance, right? To the extent that you're not having students show up in school on a given day, that's funding lost. And that points to some of the tension. The reason California funds students based on attendance is because of this fiscal incentive. There's a direct monetary reason for districts to want to get students in school because of those funding implications. But then again, to the extent that districts aren't able to get them to school, that's a potential cost. And when we look at which districts have these relatively low attendance rates, although there is a substantial amount of variation across districts in attendance, we see that on average, the districts with the lowest attendance rates tend to have more high-need students. So to the extent that we, again, have this incentive around attendance and potential penalty for poor attendance, we see that landing on districts that have more high-need students. So if we were to switch to an enrollment-based funding system, there could be additional funds for these districts that are specifically struggling with attendance, but again, those tend to be on average districts with greater shares of high-need students.
And how would incorporating a regional cost adjustment into the LCFF base grant reshape funding across rural, urban, and suburban districts? And what are really the trade-offs inherent in this change?
So there's discussion around the regional cost adjustments comes to what we think of the base grant and the LCFF doing, right? It's meant to fund the general education for a typical student, right? And before you consider additional funds or challenges related to various kinds of high need statuses. And when you think of the base grant in that way, there's this question about cost of living, in a place that has relatively high costs, housing costs, higher wages, wage costs for districts. That's a place where, again, the average education for the typical student is more expensive, again, because of these costs. So we consider a regional cost adjustment to take those factors into account. But given the distribution of income across California and the way those regional costs vary, again, going to the implications for the distribution of funds in terms of high-need students, we would see those districts with the higher regional costs, these sort of high-cost areas, also tend to have generally higher incomes and fewer high-need students. So again, shifting to these regional cost adjustments or adding these regional cost adjustments to the funding formula would have these potentially regressive implications where you would see more funding for districts with potentially lower costs or potentially higher costs, but lower shares of high-need students, and rural areas, places that are sparser, have lower housing costs and other lower regional costs, also tend to have slightly higher shares of high-need students. So there would be this shift away from those rural high-need districts to higher cost areas, which still have, of course, substantially high shares of high need students, but in general are slightly less high need on average than some of the rural districts that would be on the other end of regional cost adjustments.
Now, you mentioned high need students, and the current formula counts each high need student only once, even if they fall into multiple categories. What would be the fiscal and distributional effects of providing duplicated funding for students with multiple needs?
Right. So the way the LCFF works, right, it's around these unduplicated counts. So there are three student groups that generate additional funds. These are the ones that make up this high need students definition. First, we have low-income students who are identified as participating or identified through their participation in the free and reduced price meals program, and then also English learners and foster youth. But again, coming back to these unduplicated counts, the way students are counted is that if you have, for example, a student that is low income and also an English learner, that's only counted as a single high need student. And that creates this tension, right? We identify these high need students as needing additional resources because of the various challenges associated with being low income or being an English learner. But then when you have a student with both of these sets of challenges, we only fund them once, as a single high need student. And so if we were to sort of take that tension and address it, through something like duplicated counts, where a student in multiple groups, we call them in the report, quote unquote, dual need students, and provide them sort of double funding for each of their two needs, we would see much more funding or an increase in funding for districts that have the higher shares of these dual need students. And typically that tracks with general shares of high need students, places that are 70, 80, 90% unduplicated counts would also have relatively high shares of dual need students. But there is some substantial variation within that. There are some districts that are 80% high need currently, but when you look at their shares of dual need students, they're actually relatively low compared to other districts at similar levels of high need. So adjustment specifically targeted at duplicated counts or these dual need students wouldn't universally provide more funds along the current lines of the LCFF in terms of which districts have high shares of high need students.
Thank you. We're going to be right back after this break. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Thanks again, Iwunze, for joining us from the Public Policy Institute of California on the Maddy Report today. We're talking about LCFF, the Local Control Funding Formula, which funds local educational agencies across the state of California. Considering the options modeled in the brief and in the report that you talk about, what are the main policy trade-offs between directing more funds to high-need districts and addressing cost pressures in high-cost regions?
We try not to present them as trade-offs between one or the other throughout the report. What we do, we consider various alternatives, throughout the kind of structure of the LCFF, whether that's attendance-based funding, duplicated counts, or various things like the way we measure high need students, using free meals versus direct certification, and on and on. And although there are a lot of different changes, and we try to bring those together in a way that's comparable by describing them in terms of how they would affect funds across the distribution of currently measured high need students, we try to think of each one on their own terms first. So for example, enrollment-based funding versus attendance-based funding, that's specifically about this difference between districts with high and low shares of attendance. But then of course, in order to make the numbers a little comparable across metrics, we talk a lot about them in terms of what that means for high need students. And although that's valuable, I think each alternative, should kind of first be analyzed on the measure itself, right? Should we adjust attendance, for example, versus do we need to direct more or less funds to high need students, which is, one way to consider it. And, when you look at cost adjustments versus attendance-based funding, right, those are sort of two, one is sort of more funds for high need students and the other is less funds for high need students generally. But that's not the main way I consider the analysis. I think, there are specific questions about, how we focus on or how we address funds to target high regional costs, for example. And then, on the other side, I think there are specific questions about how we ought to fund or not fund attendance versus enrollment. And I think those questions are perhaps more important than, should we direct more or less funds to high need students, which I think is a useful frame to compare metrics, but not the primary means by which I would analyze each of the various alternatives.
And you talk, I think you answered this already in sort of your answer right now, but you talk about the alternatives that are presented. How might these alternatives affect the distribution of, billions of LCFF dollars across California's more than 1,000 school districts and nearly 6 million students?
Yeah, the system is huge, right? 6 million students, 10,000 schools, 1,000 school districts, and each one is different. We, again, try to summarize by talking about the shares of high need students, which is a useful frame. But, throughout the report, and especially in the appendix of the report, there's a substantial amount of variation even across that. Looking at, again, the example we had earlier when we, look at different districts in terms of their shares of dual need students, right? You have, let's say, a set of districts that are all around 80% high need, but then within that, some have pretty high shares of dual needs students, and some have relatively low shares of dual needs students, right? And what that means for something like duplicated counts could be quite varied. So that's why we do a lot of work in the report to go through these simulations and look at how funding would change across the broad spectrum of districts in order to put some numbers to these questions, because it is difficult to get a sense of how various changes, again, on sort of specific parts of the funding formula could affect districts generally first, but then also specifically. And there's quite a range of what could happen for each district given various changes under consideration. That said, though, that the scale is huge. California spends several billions of dollars in education, and shifting different percentages here and there could drive substantial numbers of funding across districts. So I think these questions are incredibly important given the scale of the challenge here. So it's really worth considering exactly what could change for districts as we adjust various parts of the funding formula.
Thank you. We'll be right back after this to wrap up our conversation with Iwunze Ugo from the Public Policy Institute of California. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Iwunze, thanks again for joining us on the Maddy Report today. Really appreciate your insights. And for folks who want to go and read the PPIC report, they can go on PPIC's website and read it on there, I assume? Yes,
that's correct. The report's called Updating California School Funding Formula, and you can find it at www.ppic.org.
Well, great. Well, thanks again. We'll dive into the rest of our conversation here in just a second. So the brief highlights, the policy report in the brief highlights persistent achievement gaps and chronic absenteeism. In what ways do these challenges complicate discussions solely about funding formulas, and what additional policy levers might be important beyond finance?
Yeah, that's an important point to raise. Of course, the report's about funding, and we think resources are incredibly important. There's a lot of evidence that additional resources can drive a lot of changes and improvements in student outcomes, but that's not the whole story. There's this question of, yes, you get the resources, you get the funding to, again, provide services for students, but what those services are can be incredibly important. And then additionally, the way we think about governance and the way those resources are marshaled or organized can also have important implications for students.
If policymakers were to recommend one change from the analyses presented in the report, which change would you prioritize and why? And what evidence from the report sort of informs that choice?
Yeah, so this is a needle that's a bit tough to thread. We do this work to really get these questions of, if you were to adjust the funding in various ways, what would those numbers be? And that's something that's been hard to pin down, right? The analysis behind the various alternatives is quite complex. California has, again, thousands of districts, and the implications across various changes are quite complex. So what our main contribution in the report is really putting numbers to those questions. So, there are various things that have been under consideration, enrollment-based funding, different adjustments to the funding formula, regional cost adjustments. And rather than landing on one particular reform that the state ought to do, we really try to put numbers to those questions so that as policymakers are considering different alternatives, they're going into those discussions clear-headed with, an or a useful sense of what the actual implications, both distributionally and then overall, in terms of overall costs, could be of considering various alternatives.
Now, looking ahead, what additional data or research would be most useful for evaluating the impact of these potential funding formula changes on student achievement and equity?
I think this comes back to your earlier question about additional challenges beyond funding. Of course, there's more work to do on different changes to the funding formula and those implications, and we're going to be continuing to do that work here at PPIC. But this other question about not just how much funding you get, but what you do with the funding and the way different sort of resources and services and other kinds of investments for students affect student outcomes, I think is where we could use more information and insight.
Well, Iwunze Ugo, thank you for joining us on the Maddy Report today. It was a pleasure having you on the program, and thank you just for breaking down the insights of this report. We look forward to having you on the program again.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for tuning into the Maddy Report. To learn more about the Maddy Institute, visit themaddyinstitute.org. What makes a community thrive? How do we bridge the gap between government and policy and the people it impacts? The Maddy Institute was founded to answer questions like these, to create a link between government and the citizens it serves, and to inspire a new generation of leaders dedicated to public service. In 1999, the California legislature unanimously established the Maddy Institute in honor of former California State Senator Kenneth L. Maddy. Senator Maddy was widely respected for his commitment to bipartisan solutions and his dedication to the people of California's Central Valley. Known for his ability to work across the aisle, Senator Maddy believed that effective government begins with respectful dialogue, evidence-based policy, and a commitment to the common good. Today, the Maddy Institute continues his legacy. Our mission is threefold. 1, to promote more effective and inclusive government. 2, to encourage civic engagement. And 3, to conduct research on key issues impacting the Central Valley. Through these efforts, we aim to educate, inspire, and empower the next generation of public servants and community leaders. One of the most impactful ways we fulfill this mission is through our internship programs. Each year, the Maddy Institute provides opportunities for students from the Central Valley to work in legislative offices, both in Sacramento and Washington, D.C., as well as local government agencies. These internships give students real-world experience in policymaking, allow them to see government in action, and help them build the skills they need to make a difference in their communities. But the Maddy Institute isn't just for students. Through our civic engagement programs, we create opportunities for everyone to participate in the political process. From community forums to workshops, we bring people together to discuss important issues facing the Central Valley, like water management, air quality, economic development, and education. These events foster open dialogue, allowing citizens to engage directly with policymakers, experts, and others, creating a stronger and more informed community. And to ensure the public stays informed, the Maddy Institute produces the Maddy Report, a weekly public affairs broadcast that covers the latest issues impacting California. Each episode features interviews with lawmakers, journalists, and subject matter experts, providing insights and analysis on topics that matter to our region. Whether it's understanding new legislation or exploring solutions to local challenges, the Maddy Report is a trusted source of information for those who want to stay engaged. At the heart of everything we do is a belief that good governance requires an informed and engaged public. From nurturing young leaders to fostering dialogue, the Maddy Institute is dedicated to creating a future where the people of the Central Valley can thrive. Join us as we continue Senator Maddy's legacy. Together, we can build a brighter future, one informed and engaged citizen at a time. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.com.